Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Prosperous Nonprofit. I am really excited to be here with Mitch Stein today. And today we're going to talk all about donor advised funds and so much more. But Mitch, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we were just talking before we started recording that we've been connected on LinkedIn for a while and sort of wondering whether we had met before virtually. Yeah, just really excited to kind of dig into what you are doing with Chariot. So why don't you let's start with what you're doing today. Tell us about, your work, Chariot, all the things. And I'm going to get into like some probably like detailed questions, like explain it to me like I'm five kind of questions, but give us like the big
Sure.
picture right now.
Yeah, of course. And it's funny you mentioned about the like, did we not meet over? Because I feel like LinkedIn during the pandemic was the equivalent of like a conference where you bumped into everybody and you're like, did we
Yes.
talk there? Is that where we met?
Yeah.
So it's fun actually getting back on the road and being at conferences and meeting people in person again.
Yes.
But yes, thank you for having me. Thank you for the intro. And hey, everybody. Um, don't be scared. We're going to talk about donor advised funds, but we're going to make it very, very easy to understand and hopefully give you some nuggets of wisdom to bring back to your teams and your donors. So my name is Mitch Stein. I'm the head of strategy at Chariot. We're a company that helps nonprofits find more donor advised fund dollars and donors. It's a super fast growing segment of philanthropy. It's been growing at over 20% per year for the past 5 years. Those are just like not numbers we see in the nonprofit world and in fundraising.
Yeah.
So it's really a changing tide in philanthropy that it has come on quickly. And so a lot of people feel like, wait, I don't know enough about DAFs or need to understand how they work better. But it's okay. You're not too late. It's the perfect time to start leveling up and planning and really developing strategy around it. Um, in my role, I work on all things that are kind of growth related for our company, which includes engaging with nonprofits, engaging in educational resources and spaces like this and the podcast that you host, Stephanie. We built a tool that allows nonprofits to collect donor advised fund donations directly on their website or donation forms. And that means a donor with a DAF can use it just like they would a credit card on your checkout flow without ever leaving your page. And it's about a 15-second and 3-click process compared with when they go through their own donor advised fund platform. That takes minutes of time, which we all know in the nonprofit fundraising world, getting that time down to as low as possible is huge for conversion.
Okay. So basically, a donor could donate through their donor advised fund. So instead of like making the donation through their fund, they have Fidelity, for example, there's some sort of mechanism that Chariot has created that allows a donor to give their donation directly to the organization on the website using the form, but it's still through their fund. They just don't have to go through Fidelity, and then Fidelity has to cut a check, and then the organization gets it like 4 weeks later, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the
Okay.
problem that the reason we started and what we're trying to solve is the fact that a DAF is like a charitable savings account for a donor. It's like a wallet of money that they can only use to donate to charity. And yet they can't use it in all the instances where they're most likely to donate, which is when they're inspired, they've received your email, they've a friend's doing
Yes.
a bike ride, they want to donate to their campaign, and they then have to leave that flow that you've so like obsessively crafted into the perfect conversion flow. They're leaving it and going into another platform and maybe or maybe not converting to actually making a gift. And so by unifying the experience and putting it onto the nonprofit's domain is a big unlock to just get more of those DAF gifts. They're much larger, and those donors tend to be really high potential, like major donors in general, but
Mhm.
also so that they made the gift right away. You can steward them well right away. You get their name and email, and then the back end processing is all that much easier.
So would you liken this, like as I'm hearing you talk about this, it sounds like an HSA account, right? Like a health savings account where it's like
Mhm.
we have this money that like goes from your paycheck into this health savings account that you can only use for certain expenses, like you can use for charitable purposes for a donor advised fund. And then with the health savings account, they send you like a Visa card that you can then swipe at different providers so you don't have to like go pay yourself and then get reimbursed and this whole process. You have this card that you can swipe instead. So is it like kind of like that?
Yeah, really good comparison. We compare DAFs to HSAs or 401ks a lot, just so that people can kind of have a point of reference that it's like, oh, it's tax advantage dollars for a specific use case.
Hmm.
And the challenge though is that you can't have like a normal debit or credit card from a DAF because of that like regulated use. It can only
Hmm.
leave a DAF account to be donated to a 501c3. And so that's really
Hmm.
the function that we're performing as that like processor between a donor advised fund user that wants to use it out in the world and the actual DAF account, because we're actually vetting the organization where that processing is taking place on their website, because they have to register with us to receive those gifts, where we can make sure they're a 501c3 in good standing with the IRS. It's not for a ticket purchase, those kinds of restrictions on DAFs.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Um, that's really cool. And I have your LinkedIn by like your LinkedIn profile page open, and the banner on your LinkedIn profile says it can't wait. It's for your company. And I love that. It can't wait. You're right. That's yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, so let's like back up like 20 steps just in case anybody listening is like DAF, donor advised fund. What is that? So, can
Yeah.
you explain to us what a donor advised fund is? Like, explain it like I'm five.
Yeah, of course. So anyone, any individual can have a donor advised fund account. You, me, your mom, your family member, anyone. They can set it up just like a normal bank account, and they can put money into it, regular cash, or if they have something like securities, publicly traded stocks, bonds, or even like non-publicly traded securities, like a real estate asset or a piece of art, like anything can be put into a donor advised fund account. When you do that, you get a tax receipt back from the donor advised fund manager that you can write off the full value of what you contributed from your taxes. It's now in an account where you can only take money out of it to distribute to 501c3 nonprofit organizations. But while it's in the account, you can invest it, just like the HSA example you raised. Like, you can choose to invest in some mutual funds or specific securities. Like, you can grow that balance while you're holding it in reserve to use to donate to nonprofits over time. Um, so it's been really popular with people, especially if they have like a specific wealth event or they are compensated as part of their job with stock. Because when you donate, contribute stock into your donor advised fund account, you get that full write off and you avoid capital gains tax that you might have to owe on those securities. So that was like the original reason why I would say people use DAFs and why they got popular 10, 15 years ago, more on like the ultra high net worth end of the market. But what's happened more recently is that they have been really exploding in the broader spectrum of donors, where people are realizing like, yes, there's those tax benefits. And this is just a really good way to stay accountable to my goals with philanthropy. So, like, I have a donor advised fund and I contribute $100 a month to it. And it's my way of making sure that I'm like staying true to goals. And I get a match from my employer who puts another $100 into my donor advised fund each month. So you're seeing this like growth on both ends of the spectrum of like why people use a DAF. Everything from like the super wealthy and kind of optimizing their taxes on down to kind of the rest of us, the more mass audience of donors who just want to do a better job.
That makes so much sense. Yes, I love that explanation. Thank you. And why do people choose to put money into a donor advised fund versus just giving to the charity directly now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's also worth raising, and at this point too, that DApps do come with a bit of controversy. And I think it's important for nonprofit fundraisers to be aware of that context, where sometimes There's like negative headlines around them because there's $230 billion that are currently sitting in donor advised funds that, according to the IRS, have been donated to charity. Like tax receipts have been issued for that money, but
Mm-hmm.
it's sitting in a bank account and not at a nonprofit. So a lot of people have
Mm-hmm.
rightly said, like, oh, there's all this money sitting on the sidelines. Like, we want to move more of it and activate it. And how can we make sure nonprofits are getting it faster? And I think that's some of the criticism, to your point, where someone might say, like, well, why are you giving it into your DAP? You should just make a donation. And I think that the important thing to remember is related to donor psychology is like, there's actually two decisions being made anytime someone makes a gift. They're determining how much they want to budget to charity. In that moment, it's like, okay, wait, I'm doing some mental calculation. It might even be subconscious. I'm like, oh yeah, I can give $100, $500, whatever my math is, I can give that away. The second decision is, where do I want it to go? And whenever you combine those two decisions into one instance, it slows people down and they're less likely to give. When you separate those decisions, so I'm making an intentional decision, $100 a month or whatever, our founders have all committed to donating 10% of their income to charity. That's why they've started the business, by the way. They're trying to figure out good ways to manage that goal, came across DAFs and realized they were hard to use and started the tool. So kind of a fun backstory. But in that instance, when you are making a commitment and making that budget allocation separately, now I have money set aside that I can give strategically. I can really invest in how I want to give that money away, grow closer to those organizations, do my research, and have kind of like aside funds that are growing in the meantime to give out opportunistically when my friend's running the marathon or someone's doing a bike ride. And you give way more because it's like already set aside. It's not a current budget decision. So I just put all that out there to say that the world would be a better place if everyone who donated, in my opinion, used a DAF, because they would be intentionally setting a goal, setting a budget, setting money aside, and then putting it to work and ultimately giving more away. So I think it's a bit of the comparison is, in my opinion, not the best one to say, like, they put that money in a DAF, they should give it to charity, because they're really just kind of front loading giving that they can do over time. And the actual statistics about donor advised fund payouts are pretty high relative to what we're used to from things like foundations. Like, they've been over 20% of the total balance on an annual basis, like since they started tracking it in 2007. So yes, we agree. Like, and that's Chariot's goal, is how do we move more of this money faster and make sure people are using it more regularly and that DAFs are more usable. And also recognizing that, like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, the structure and format of a DAF is actually really valuable to engaging donors and your supporters in philanthropy.
Mm-hmm. This is so helpful. Okay, so like I was saying before, we work with a ton of nonprofits, and a lot of them are receiving donations through DAFs, through donor advised funds, and I kind of always just had it in my head that, like, well, this is like rich people that are just like putting all a bunch of money into this donor advised fund, and it's only for rich people. And I was considering people like much, much wealthier than myself. Um, but I really like this idea of, like, it's kind of like this savings account where you're just like plugging money in, just like you would if you had like a vacation fund, right? You're plugging money in so then that the ultimate payout is like you go on this vacation that you saved up for. And so I guess as long as you spend it, you put it in, and then as long as you allocate it to a charity at some point. I really like this. I'm like, okay, I need to set up a donor advised fund for myself now. So the work that y'all are doing at Chariot is really it's on the donor side of things, making the process easier for them to connect with organizations and get the money out of their donor advised fund to the charity. Is there like, what is the, like, this is a weird thing to say. What is the motivation, I guess, for a donor to get the funds out of their, Fidelity or whatever account, because they've already gotten the tax write-off. So like, what is the push to get them to do that? And I know your solution is trying to make it easier for them, but like,
Mm-hmm.
how are they seeing the urgency to move the funds out of there?
Yeah, and it's a great question because, and we do tons of donor interviews as part of like developing the products that we build at Chariot. And it is pretty shocking how many people are like, "Oh yeah, I have a DAF account. I haven't looked. It's been like a year since I looked. How much money is in there?" It's like, wait a second, you don't know. But I think that is more of a symptom of the problem we're solving,
Mhm,
in that if I can't use something anywhere, then yeah, I'm not going to think about it very often. And
mhm,
it's like,
mhm,
yeah, I am going to think about it once I'm doing my tax planning or like meeting with my accountant, instead of every time that I think about supporting a nonprofit, I can just use it right there. I mean, just imagine you
mhm,
had a gift card that you couldn't use. You had to go like log into your bank account to use your gift card at Starbucks. Like, how likely are you to stop into Starbucks versus knowing
yeah.
how usable a gift card is, and you walk in, you're going to both use it more often and spend more money, because the money, it's like, whenever we already have allocated money to something, it's like fun money. It feels so much
Mhm,
more like, I mean, and think about when you're checking out somewhere with a gift card, what's the first question you always ask? How much is on it?
mhm,
Because you're
mhm,
planning like, oh yeah, I'm going to just use all of it here. So there's all this psychology that goes into it that's super interesting. So your question of like, how do we actually appeal to a donor, I think is
mhm,
really important. Um, Two of the ways that are kind of like a baseline thing that every nonprofit can do better is just highlighting donor advised funds as a way to give more prominently and more regularly. So having it in communications whenever you're soliciting gifts, having it on your website and around your donation form, just honestly reminding people that that's like a really good way to give, and spelling the words out. Another
mhm,
tip that we share, um, that most donor advised fund donors aren't familiar with the acronym DAF. So
mhm,
be sure to spell it out anywhere in your communications. But yeah, I think
yeah,
making it more prominent is a big one. And then, like you said, yes, making it easier
mhm,
is definitely key. And yes, Chariot offers solutions to do that, but anyone can make it easier. Like, if you have a section on your website that highlights donor advised fund giving, share your EIN right there so that if they are going back to their portal, they can plug it in and get to the right organization. Share your legal name so that when it pops up on their portal, because that's the other thing, is these databases at the DAF are like a mess. That's another thing
mm,
that we help our nonprofit customers with, is actually seeing how they're listed across. I mean, there's 1,151 donor advised funds, everything
wow.
from Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab to, like religious specific ones, to basically
Mhm,
every community foundation in the country. There's
yeah.
so many of them, and how organizations are listed, their name and their address can differ like in extreme ways across those. And it's not just tiny organizations. Like, this is true for some of our biggest customers, where we've had to go in and help them update address information because checks could have just been going to the wrong place and they would have had no idea.
You know, it's so interesting that you say this. I literally got an email today from a donor advised fund to me. It is a former client that I no longer work with, but they reached out to me and they're like, somebody from our donor advised fund wants to give to your organization, but we can't find your address, or the check got bounced, like it bounced, or it didn't bounce, but it got sent back or whatever. And it's really interesting that we're having this conversation. I literally just got this email like a couple hours ago. So imagine how much money is just lost in in the ether, in the universe, because of exactly what you're saying. That's so interesting. And do you have a product that can like help? I feel like I saw something on your website. Do you have a product that can help nonprofits like figure that out if if there's missing pieces, or the address is wrong, or the name's wrong, or something?
Yeah, so we have a tool called DAF Scan, which is doing just that. It's scanning how an organization is listed within a database that all of the major DAFs are using. And like I said, this is when we work with about 6,000 nonprofits today. So we ran like a test, like an aggregate test across our current customers. And over 40% of them had an inconsistency with their name or address. Like, this
Oh
is
my
not like a
gosh.
rare occurrence. Some of them are like relatively minor, um but a lot of them are like the wrong suite in an office building, or the wrong building in a complex,
Mhm.
like these little things, but like you won't get your mail that way. Like it is a
Right.
real issue.
Yeah. And I'm looking at, I have your website open and I'm just looking at a quote that says, "We were shocked to find out there were over 100 different addresses for us across DAF platforms." And that sounds like a pretty large organization, 100 different addresses across these things. So think about like 100, hundreds of donations that are never making their way to nonprofits because of like little silly admin things. That's
Well,
bananas.
the other really frustrating thing, in my opinion, is when these things happen, like which are happening all the time, a donor is with all the best intention going into their DAF account, making a gift, and then they're reaching out to the nonprofit and saying like, "Well, I sent it. Where is it?" Or
Hmm.
like, "Did you not get it? Did you lose it?" Donors are having a bad impression of the nonprofit when like,
Mm-hmm.
it's so not their fault, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
process is very broken, and it's
Mm-hmm.
frustrating to see it leave a bad impression of the organization's like capabilities,
Mm-hmm.
when there's like, this process is different for every single DAF, and that's a big thing we've helped to solve and are continuously improving on with Chariot's tools. DAF Pay is the name of our button that can sit right on a donation form. But one of the biggest things is when that occurs on your checkout process, you get that donor's name and email and the gift immediately. So you now
Mm.
have insight into gift initiation to track it and understand when it's missing. So you can reach out to the DAF, say like, "This was initiated 3 weeks ago. Why didn't it come?" Or, there's just no one's ever had that insight before because DAF gifts were exclusively made off platform.
Mhm.
And so it just showed up and you had no insight into it. So being able to
Mhm.
encourage donors to give in this way also helps you just have more insight and information so that you don't look like behind or not on top of your stuff, when something goes missing, because it's going to happen. Checks aren't
Mhm.
going to arrive. We see this all the time. Something we're working on solutions for. But yeah, the actual back end processing stuff, all of your nonprofit fundraising listeners will definitely resonate with these stories. It's
Mhm.
something that happens all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like what the email that I got this morning that was like, this check came back. We have not been able to send it to you. Who do we send this to? I mean, that organization, I forwarded it to them to, respond. But I mean, that could be potentially thousands and thousands of dollars that they're not getting access to because of like administrative inefficiencies. And then what's the programmatic impact? Then what could they have done with that thousands and thousands of dollars? I don't know. That's really, really interesting. Okay. So you've told us, we like definitely everyone needs to go check out givechariot.com because you will see all of the things that Chariot does. But I would love to know, like, what should nonprofit leaders be doing? Like, what can they do right now to start kind of closing this gap and eliminating some of these, administrative clunky things that will help them get access to more donor advised funds or kind of clean up the process for themselves? What should they be doing right now?
Yeah, excellent question. I would say, first of all, Chariot integrates with a number of donor advised fund platforms and is already Chariot integrates with a number of fundraising platforms to enable like those 3-click DAF Pay giving, as a native feature. So double check our integration list, and if your current fundraising platform already has this as a feature, first of all, just make sure it's turned on. There's no cost to turn that on, and you're just bringing in net new donor advised fund donors through your existing fundraising tools. So that's number one. It's like definitely check and make sure.
Yes.
And if you don't have a live integration, just be sure and ask your provider if that's something you're interested in. Because we're working to onboard more and more fundraising platforms every week. So separate and apart from working directly with Chariot as a subscription customer, like that's an easy way to start using DAF Pay without onboarding a new platform. But separate from that, I think there's a couple main things that organizations should all be taking into account. Number one is you're already doing it. Check done. You're listening to a podcast to learn more about donor advised funds. I think the best first step you can take is just increasing your own understanding, and the capacity within your team. There's been a lot of great research that's been conducted on nonprofit organizations' familiarity with DAFs. And it was something like less than 40% of fundraisers said that they felt comfortable talking about DAFs with a donor. And
Mm,
I just think it's such, obviously you're not an advisor, you shouldn't be playing that role. So like with appropriate disclaimers, but you don't want to be telling someone what to do with their money or what accounts to set up. But being able to have an intelligent conversation about like, oh, you're thinking about using a DAF, or your family has a DAF, or your parents have a DAF, tell me more about it. And being comfortable in that space in a one-on-one conversation with a donor is huge, because that's building relationship. You're getting more insight in how they think about their philanthropy. You're now serving as a resource to them. Like there's just so many
mhm,
benefits. And this is a really hot topic. And it's a really valuable business for financial advisors who are able to
mm,
continue managing money and assets once they're in a DAF account. So I bring that up because people are going to be hearing about this from their financial advisors. And it's coming up a
mm,
lot, and it's a more and more popular topic. So having that understanding to have a good conversation is really key. So education, first and foremost, is huge. And just like spreading the word within your organization, making sure your leadership understands the importance of donor advised funds, your other fundraisers, your finance department. Like it's really something that, as we've touched on, like it really affects every part of the organization. And it's something that's been changing really quickly. So a lot of people don't feel comfortable or have a lot of background. There's a ton of resources on our blog. I also share things about donor advised funds almost every day on LinkedIn. So we can definitely connect there. But, and I try to also just pass on resources and helpful articles. So I would say number one, first and foremost, is getting up to speed and increasing that education. And the second thing is something we were touching on earlier, is just making sure that you have in your communications and any time that you are engaging with donors digitally, not in that one-on-one setting, that they also are being reminded about DAFs. You're making it easy, and just kind of doing an audit of those things. I think that's another good step to take that doesn't require anything new or any new investments. It's just looking at like, okay, do our solicitation emails mention donor advised funds as a way to give? Check. Like, does our mailer say anything about donor advised funds? Do we have a place on our website that talks about this? Like that kind of checklist and audit is another really good step.
mhm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I just feel like with everything, people need multiple reminders. They're not going to see something once and then it's permanently implanted in their brain. They need to see it again and again and again. And so I think that's such great advice. Like keep reminding them, put it all over the place, put it in your emails, put it on your website. Yeah, I think that's huge. And I was going to mention the blog at givechariot.com because I think that, I mean, even this conversation, I feel so much more knowledgeable than I did before. And so, for any of our listeners to really feel like you can have an intelligent conversation about donor advised funds, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff on the givechariot.com website. So I feel like we could keep going with this, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey. I know you're a social entrepreneur, you're a community builder, you are an impact innovator. How did you get to be doing what you're doing right now? Tell us about your journey.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I have definitely had kind of an interesting path to the current work that I'm doing. I was an investment banker at Goldman Sachs for many years at the start of my career. I went to school for finance and accounting. But kind of over time, while I was in a few different roles at the company, I was also getting deeply invested in nonprofit work. Kind of outside of work, I started doing a bike ride fundraiser from Boston to New York called Cycle for the Cause, which is the Northeast AIDS ride that my dad and I started in 2016, or started participating in 2016 in honor of my uncle, Marlon, who we'd lost to AIDS. And I'd done some volunteering and kind of fundraising things in the past, but that was something that really like brought my whole family into a cause and an event that was super personal and meaningful to us. And I just became kind of obsessed with it, is probably putting it lightly. And over time, we were raising, like just me and my dad were raising like over $100,000 a year. I had like a donor
Wow.
file of like 1,000 people. And it really
Oh my
became
gosh.
like this big undertaking that I was sort of doing in my spare time. And I just started becoming more and more passionate about like improving the way things worked and the tools that we were using. And I was covering the technology, software, and internet space as an investment banker. So that started how those worlds started to collide for me. Um, and I ended up leaving my job to start a company called Pond, which was a marketplace between nonprofit organizations and their vendors. So helping organizations find better tools and services, making sure they're not paying too much for them. And I just felt like the sector is, as we can all appreciate, it's huge. There's like over 1 million nonprofits, millions of people working at them. It's such a vital, important part, not only of like society, but also a huge part of the economy. And how could we kind of organize the way that they're doing business and working with different vendors into a single platform? I worked on that for about 3 years, and an amazing experience. Built up, an amazing network, but ultimately we couldn't just quite get it to sustainably grow, and kind of went the way of the vast majority of startups. Ended up having to close our doors. But I would say it was just a really a clear, now that I'm over a year past that point, like such a clear step forward towards like the next thing. And this just shared effort with that community of how do we keep improving the sector and bringing better tools to market, better solutions for people. And that's what led me to start working with Chariot. I started consulting with a few different nonprofit technology companies over the course of last year. One of those was Chariot, and they got me on board full time. And I was just really inspired by the work they're doing to unlock more of this funding for nonprofits, but also just, every day we're trying to think about innovations around stuff that everyone just assumed this was the way it worked. Everyone just assumed that you had to go to your DAF platform and checks had to move in the mail, and that was just the way it had to be done. And so I just am really love being somewhere where we don't take anything for not to take it for granted. That's not what I mean. We don't like take anything as like the way it has to be, which is such a
Yes.
refreshing attitude and so
Mhm.
needed in our sector. So I'm just really excited about everything we're doing.
Yeah, that's what I mean, I'm just like nodding vigorously over here because I just agree. I mean, in the nonprofit sector, it does seem in many, many ways that it's like, well, this is the way we've always done it. And it's like, okay, well, I guess that's how we have to keep doing it. So I love that you've, after your investment banking career, that you've really made a career out of like technology innovation for nonprofits. And I don't feel like there's enough of that. And I love that. And I love seeing this sort of entrepreneurial, innovative mindset being, sort of going right into the nonprofit sector. We need it so, so much. So I love that. And that's what this podcast is all about, like talking about organizations and people that are doing things in new, innovative, disruptive, entrepreneurial ways, because I just think these are not conversations that the sector as a whole is having often enough.
Yeah.
So cool.
And I was just going to add, because we were speaking about this before we started recording, but I think what I attribute a lot of those shortcomings to the fact that nonprofits are like subject to systems that they're like recipients of. So like the DAF is
Mhm.
the perfect example where like I'm not the customer of a donor advised fund as the nonprofit. Like I'm getting money from them. So there's just this power imbalance that I find super frustrating. And we hear this from nonprofit staff that we talk to all the time, that they're like, these donor advised funds have never spoken to a gift processor before. They
Mhm.
have no idea the headaches they're creating for me. And it's like, just because we're receiving the money, we should just accept it however it's coming. And like,
Mhm.
that's what gets me up and excited. And when I get out of bed in the morning, is that like, we're in a position to really like customize solutions to the nonprofit specific problem, even in settings where they've traditionally not been like on the favorable end of a power imbalance. And I just think
Mhm.
this is one example of that, but there's like so many, particularly in like donor relationships or funder relationships, where like you're receiving the money. And so people think you should just put up with however it's going to come. And it's like, that's just
Mhm.
so short-sighted. You're putting a burden
Yes.
on the organization, you're limiting their impact, and it's not achieving the goal anyone set out to achieve. So anyway, I'll step
Mm-hmm.
off my soapbox, but just reiterating what you were getting at.
Yeah, I completely agree because often I feel like my team and I we're on the processing end of all of this. And so when things are clunky and the process is not smooth, it costs organizations more money and like us more time to process them. And so that's taking away resources that could be going elsewhere. So yeah, completely agree with you. Um, so I'm really interested, maybe from like a personal, maybe this is like a selfish question. I'm personally interested in like, what are the hardest parts of building technology for the nonprofit sector? I'm like I said, I'm kind of asking for selfish reasons because I have this idea of a software related to financial management and forecasting and projection specifically for nonprofits that I've been sitting on for like 5 years because I'm too scared to like take action on it because I don't like it just feels like I'm jumping off a cliff into like this whole new world. And so I'm like, I don't even know where to start. So, what are maybe you should start with telling me the best part. No, start with telling me the hardest parts, and then you could tell me the best parts of building technology for nonprofit.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing. I feel like that's kind of the hardest part when you have an idea for something is you're almost like embarrassed or you're like, oh, I don't know if it's going to work. So I don't know if I should share it. But so thank you for just like voicing that and wanting to talk about it. Because that's the first step is just like getting it out there. That's what starts to make it real is having conversations about it, especially in front of an audience, which you're doing, which is super brave. Um, and I also think like your trepidation is warranted because it is really hard. Like I think I experienced that firsthand. I in trying to build my startup, I honestly one of the quick learnings I had was I moved too quickly into just building like a platform and trying to grow it before I'm like I should have spent a year where I was like consulting for nonprofits to help them with vendor selection. Like if I'd actually
Mm,
done the service and then tried to map a tool to it, which is where I feel like you're coming from, which is smart.
mhm,
Like you've kind of you've sort of validated the need for this solution because the existing solution is like a human spending their valuable time mapping it out. I think you've taken a really good step of like iterating on the more manual human driven process before you have a piece of technology. So I think that's really smart. The hardest part though is that distribution. Um, Again,
mhm,
you have an existing client base, so you're also a step ahead in how to kind of bring these things to market. I think for what I did, we tried to go the more traditional kind of startup route where you raise some pre-seed capital from angel investors, and we're trying to raise venture capital, and like how do we scale this super fast? And I think things generally don't scale in this space at a similar rate other industries or end user audiences. And so that can make it really difficult to meet the expectations of a VC. Does that mean that that's the only way that
mhm,
you can develop a product or business and grow it? Absolutely not. But that is just a big challenge. Like the distribution is tough.
mhm.
So if you've got like a special angle, like having an existing audience and customer base that you can start to develop a product with, that's really smart.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that sort of personal consulting and coaching.
No,
I
it's
appreciate that.
we I spent a lot of time, like I said, I was consulting for a lot of different founders of different kinds of startups in the social impact space last year. And I spent a lot of time thinking about, could we create a fund that helps like invest in these types of businesses and get them off the ground? I ultimately decided like maybe at some point in the future, personally, I wasn't in like a place where that could work for me, but I still talk to people about those kinds of things all the time. And I feel like in the next few years, there's going to be some dedicated like philanthropy to the
Mhm,
business of serving nonprofits because there isn't someone today that is like missionally aligned to entrepreneurship around nonprofit
mhm,
organizations, which I think is a shame. I think it's a real shame that we
mhm.
don't have more investment from philanthropy in businesses that serve nonprofits.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's just sort of like widening the ecosystem. So I feel like, yeah, it's gotta be coming. But that's a good point because I feel like I've also kind of looked around, and I've also looked around for funders who are interested in funding like financial management education for nonprofits,
Mm.
because we have like an online course and workshops and things like that. And so I've looked for, foundations and funders that are funding that type of work. And they're out there, but they're like few and far between. So,
Yeah, the capacity building is like, it's been a bit of a buzzword, I think, in nonprofit funding. I mean, before I was even, more deeply involved in this sector, but I don't, to your point, it's like people are talking about it, but are they changing? Is their money going where their mouth is? I'm not sure how quickly that's happening yet.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Okay, I feel like I could keep chatting with you, but I'm going to start to wrap us up. So one question that I always ask all of our guests before we leave is, what does a prosperous nonprofit look like to you?
Ooh, I love that question. I just think a culture of kind of continuous improvement is so valuable because it leaves the door open to people on your staff feeling empowered to want to improve things. And that might sound like simple or obvious, but I've seen so many folks working in nonprofits that are like get excited about a solution or like to a problem that they're having internally or a new tool they want to try out or whatever, and then their manager's like, we don't have any budget, sorry. It's just like
Mhm.
stonewalling that kind of ideation around innovation, and I think it's such a shame to not foster that attitude in people and in the culture,
Mhm.
because there's just always room to evolve and improve, and that's what is prospering if not like evolving and improving. So
Yes. I love that. I love that. And I feel like that comes from this like startup entrepreneurial culture where you're constantly ideating and coming up with new ideas and finding creative solutions. And I want to see more of that in the sector as well. So I love that you mentioned that.
yeah.
Awesome. Mitch, this has been so great to chat with you. Tell all of our listeners, please, where they can learn more about Chariot and where they can connect with you.
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm very prolific on LinkedIn, so let's
Yes.
definitely connect there. And feel free to shoot me a message. I try to always respond to them. But Mitch Stein on LinkedIn, hopefully you'll find me. If you're connected to Stephanie, or you should find me quickly.
Yes. Yep.
And then my email is just mitch@givechariot.com. So if it's easier to reach out directly and you've got questions about donor advised funds or Chariot or anything, I'm always happy to catch up.
Awesome. Yes, maybe that's why I felt like we met because I follow you on LinkedIn and I feel like I know you and I've like followed along with your journey. So that probably is why I feel like we've met before, right? Like, no, I just stalk you on LinkedIn. That's how I feel like I know you.
I've heard it before. I've had people come up to me in coffee shops, at a wedding, at a restaurant.
Really?
I think I follow you on LinkedIn. Yeah.
That's so funny. Well, you have 12,000 followers, so I feel like the odds of that are pretty good. Um,
Yeah, I'm a
awesome.
huge fan of LinkedIn. So it's
Yes,
where I spend
yeah.
a lot of time.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again for your time. And everybody definitely go check out Chariot at givechariot.com and then go find Mitch over on LinkedIn. Mitch, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.